Okay, today we're going to go ahead and talk about the last tab in our foldable. And again, our foldable is on solving quadratics, which is Unit 11 right now. And we're going to go ahead and talk about quadratic formula. Before I keep going, showing you the quadratic formula, here's one thing that's important to understand. Whenever you see a problem, always try to factor it first to get an answer. And then after that, if it's not factorable, quadratic formula is probably the best way to solve it, okay, for most of them. So let's go ahead and look at quadratic formula. Okay, here's the quadratic formula if you want to go ahead and take a second to write it down. We have it down here. Notice how you have A, B's, and C's. These are going to be the same A, B's, and C's that we've been talking about. A is always the number in front of x squared. B is always the number in front of x. C is always the number by itself. If you look up here, though, just make sure you have all the stuff rearranged on one side of the equation before you actually figure out your A, B, and C. So let's go ahead and look at a few problems with quadratic formula. All right, if we look at number one, ideally the first thing you'd want to try to do is factor the problem. This problem will factor, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to get the answers with quadratic formula, and then I'll show you what it would factor out to, and so we can see that they actually match up. So in number one, A is the number in front of x squared, so A is 1. B is the number in front of x, so that's 5. And C is the number at the end, which is 6. Since they're all on one side of the equation, they're pretty easy to figure out on that. So here's the quadratic formula again. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay? So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put these numbers in the formula. Since negative b is the first thing I need, b is 5, so negative b should be negative 5. I'm going to put a lot of these in parentheses, it just makes it easier. So I have b squared, so 5 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 6. And that whole thing is all over 2 times a. Okay? Here's what I want you to focus on in this problem. I have a negative 5 first, and then a plus or minus, and then on the bottom I end up having a 2. I end up having a 2. And I have a square root here. I don't want to type in the square root. What I want you guys to do is actually figure out the number that goes underneath the square root. So you're going to type that in your calculator. Just type in 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times 6. If you type it in like I do with the parentheses, it should give you the right answer. When you do that, you figure out the number underneath is a 1. Okay, so really that's a 1 underneath the square root. The next thing you need to decide is if you actually know the square root of 1, or if it's a tree where you can bring stuff out. The square root of 1 is actually just 1, so I'll go ahead and change it now to 1. Okay, and those are the two answers that I have at the end. Since they are whole numbers and not radicals, I can actually find those out. So negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. That divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6. And that divided by 2 is negative 3. So those should be my answers. Now the easier way that you could have done this problem is by factoring. Okay, which factoring we know doesn't always work because not everything can be factored. But if you make a t-chart, and you figure out what gives you a times c, which is 6, and what adds to give you b, which is 5, you figure out the number combination is 2 and 3. So what this originally factored out to was x plus 2, x plus 3. So when I figure out what makes each of those 0, you actually get the same answers we got, which are negative 2 and negative 3. Okay, but I would always try to factor first. If you can't do it, quadratic formula is a great way to solve any problem. Let's look at our next example. I'll leave the formula up here still. And this next problem, I have 0 on the other side, so I can go ahead and find my a, b, and c. A ends up being 3. B, the number in front of x, is negative 6. And c is 3. So I'm going to, again, go ahead and fill them in over in the formula. So negative b should be positive 6. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4. We know a is 3 and c is 3. All over 2a. Okay? So on this problem, again, I have a 6 out front, a plus or minus, and if you multiply the bottom two numbers, you also get a 6. I'm going to go ahead and figure out what number really goes underneath the radical. I'm going to type that in my calculator. When you do, you figure out that answer is 0. Okay, a 0 is really underneath the radical. Okay, the square root of 0 is actually 0. So you get 6 plus or minus 0 over 6. 6 plus 0 is 6, divided by 6 is 1. And 6 minus 0 is 6, divided by 6 is also 1. So those should be our two answers. Since they're whole numbers, that means this problem originally factored out. So let's at least look at how you can get that by just factoring. First of all, I can take out a 3 out of everything. Okay, if I take out a 3, I'm just going to write it underneath. You end up being left with x squared minus 2x plus 1. So I'm going to make a t-chart. I'm just going to focus on this part. I need to figure out what multiplies to give me 1, because that's your a times c, and what adds to give me b, which is negative 2. Okay, your answer? Negative 1 and negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 plus negative 1 is negative 2. So this factors out to x minus 1, x minus 1. So what's going to make each of those 0 is 1 and 1 again. Remember, this 3 does not have an x to solve for, so it doesn't give you an answer. Notice how we got the same answers as we did using quadratic formula. Okay, for my last two examples, these are examples that won't factor. If you tried to make a t-chart, you wouldn't be able to get one. Okay, so quadratic formula would be your best option. First thing I need to do is rearrange it so I have everything on one side. So if I move negative 2 over here, I have positive 2. Okay, and now you can identify your a, b, and c. So a is 6. B ends up being 1. C is 2. Okay, so let me write the quadratic formula up here again. Okay, and I'm just going to fill the numbers in. So negative b would be negative 1 plus or minus b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. So I just filled the variables in for the numbers, okay, that I got from my original equation. Again, I'll leave negative 1 out here. I have the plus or minus. I have the 12 on the bottom, and then I have a radical. And I want to figure out what number is going to go under the radical. Okay? If you end up typing that in your calculator without the radical, you figure out the number underneath of it is negative 47. Okay, negative 47. Okay, first of all, if you remember, when you have a negative under a radical, that is an imaginary answer, which means an I will automatically come out in front of it. Okay, so you get that. The only other thing you need to check, since you actually have a number still under the square root, can you make a tree for 47? Okay, the answer is no. Okay, 47 is a prime number, so nothing will come out. So therefore, this is the answer that you actually have for the problem and that you can type in. Remember, you can use a plus or minus on Math Excel. The only other option on Math Excel, make sure you read carefully, there may be an option that says there are no real answers. Since these are imaginary, you could click on that option, there aren't any real answers, okay, without having to type that in. Our second problem up here is similar in the fact that I got to move stuff. Okay, so 11x is going to become negative 11x on the other side. Normally you see stuff with x in the middle. So this is how you would want to rewrite it. If I have it rewritten like that, a ends up being the number next in front of x squared, which is 1. B is the number in front of x, and c is the number by itself. So those are the numbers I'm going to fill in for a, b, and c. So when I do that, I end up getting positive 11 plus or minus b squared, let's see, minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay. So again, I'll leave the 11 out front, the plus or minus, I'll leave the 2 on the bottom. And I'm going to figure out what number ends up going underneath that square root. On this one, we actually get a positive number. Okay, we get 133, I believe. So there's no need to bring an I out. All I need to check is, can I make a tree for 133? There are two numbers that you can multiply to get 133. I believe it's 7 and 19. Both of those are prime. However, I don't have two of the same thing, so I can't bring anything out. So I just got to leave this as the square root of 133. So that would be my answer for the problem.